Goedendag. This Flemish militia weapon proves that a simple design can completely upend traditional military tactics. At first glance, it looks like a thick wooden club, widening at the top and fitted with a sturdy steel spike. The genius of the design was its dual utility, allowing a soldier to either bludgeon heavily armored knights or plant the shaft firmly into the ground to impale a charging horse. During the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, local tradesmen armed with these weapons decimated the elite French cavalry, shocking the military world. It was cheap to produce and required very little training, making it the perfect equalizer for commoners fighting against professional mounted forces.
Zanbato. This enormous sword was forged with a single brutal purpose in mind, which was taking down both a horse and its rider in one sweeping motion. The weapon featured a blade so long and heavy that it required the wielder to use two hands and rely entirely on the momentum of their swing. Standard infantry struggled against mounted samurai, so blacksmiths extended the length of traditional blades to create something capable of bridging that gap. While incredibly intimidating on the battlefield, the sheer weight of the sword made it exhausting to use, meaning it was eventually phased out in favor of lighter, more practical polearms.
Cheval de frise. Moving away from hand-to-hand combat, this defensive obstacle functioned essentially as a portable barricade. The design was relatively simple, consisting of a heavy wooden log pierced with long, iron-tipped spikes facing outward in multiple directions. Soldiers would carry these frames to the front line and link them together to rapidly close off gaps in their defenses. It was particularly effective at funneling enemy riders into narrow choke points, as horses naturally refused to charge into the dense thicket of spears. The name itself translates to Frisian horse, a slightly ironic nod to the Dutch forces, who relied heavily on them to stop Spanish cavalry charges during the late 16th century.
Lochaber axe. This heavy polearm was adapted to counter English forces that frequently deployed superior numbers of mounted troops. The weapon combined a broad, cleaver-like blade for sweeping attacks with a pronounced hook securely mounted on the back of the axe head. While the blade was devastating in close quarters, that hook was specifically designed to snag a rider's armor or the reins of their horse, pulling the knight violently to the ground. Once the rider was dismounted, the heavy axe could easily pierce through plate armor. Its brutal efficiency made it a staple among Highland clans for centuries, before modern firearms rendered it obsolete.
Makibishi. These small, multi-pointed iron spikes were designed to be completely invisible until it was too late. Developed in feudal Japan, they were primarily used by retreating forces to slow down pursuing cavalry. A handful of these spikes scattered across a road would always land with one sharp point facing straight up. When a horse stepped on the metal barb, the sudden pain would cause it to buck or collapse, throwing the rider and causing a chain reaction of chaos within the pursuing formation. They were incredibly difficult to sweep away in the heat of battle, creating an immediate, invisible barrier that forced enemy riders to a grinding halt.
Gazarm. This European polearm evolved directly from standard agricultural tools, specifically the pruning hooks used by medieval peasants. When levied into military service, those farmers simply attached their farming implements to long wooden shafts, creating a makeshift but highly effective weapon. The curved hook at the top was perfectly shaped to catch the legs of a charging horse, or pull a rider from their saddle with a sharp downward tug. Over time, professional blacksmiths refined the design by adding an upward-facing spear point, allowing soldiers to defend against a direct charge before switching to hooking maneuvers. It stands as a perfect example of civilian tools being adapted to solve the terrifying problem of facing down armored cavalry.
Bohemian ear spoon. This peculiar polearm gets its name from its distinctly shaped spearhead. Below a thick, leaf-shaped blade, blacksmiths forged two heavy metallic lugs that flared outward, somewhat resembling ears. This design was highly intentional, as standard spears often penetrated a charging horse so deeply that the massive animal would slide down the shaft and crush the soldier holding it.
The flaring lugs acted as a sudden stopping point, absorbing the immense kinetic energy of a cavalry charge, while keeping the angry, wounded beast at a safe distance from the wielder.
Kusarigama. Moving back to feudal Japan, this unconventional pairing of a farming sickle and a heavy metal chain was a nightmare for mounted samurai. The weapon featured a sharp blade attached to a wooden handle, with a long, weighted chain trailing from the hilt. Instead of fighting the horse directly, warriors would swing the iron weight in a wide arc and hurl it toward the legs of the charging animal. The chain would rapidly wrap around the horse's ankles, instantly tripping the beast and throwing the heavily armored rider into the dirt. Once the knight was grounded and disoriented, the wielder simply closed the distance and used the sickle to strike at the exposed gaps in their armor.
Lucerne hammer. As European armor became thicker and more advanced, infantrymen needed a weapon that could crack a mounted knight like a walnut. Developed by Swiss mercenaries, this polearm combined a crushing, multi-pronged hammerhead with a long, piercing spike at the very top. When a cavalry charge slowed down in the mud or hit a defensive line, soldiers would use the hammer side to deliver concussive blows that bypassed the armor's hard shell, fracturing bones beneath the steel. If a rider tried to retreat, a curved hook on the reverse side of the hammerhead could snag their saddle or reins, ensuring they never escaped the battlefield.
Mancatcher. This bizarre device looks more like an animal control tool than a weapon of war, but it was specifically designed to pluck noblemen right off their horses. Mounted at the end of a long wooden pole was a spring-loaded metal collar lined with unsharpened spikes. A foot soldier would thrust this collar toward a charging knight, and the flexible metal prongs would snap shut around the rider's neck. Because wealthy knights could be ransomed back to their families for massive sums of money, pulling them violently to the ground without dealing a fatal blow was incredibly profitable. It turned the terrifying prospect of facing heavy cavalry into a lucrative opportunity for brave infantrymen.
War wagon. During the Hussite Wars in the early 15th century, Czech rebels transformed standard agricultural carts into devastating mobile fortresses to counter heavily armored crusaders. Thick wooden planks were reinforced with iron and chained together in a circle, creating a sudden, impenetrable barricade in the middle of an open field. Inside these rolling bunkers, peasants armed with early firearms and crossbows could shoot at oncoming horses with near-total protection. If enemy riders managed to reach the wooden walls, men armed with long pikes would thrust through narrow firing slits, effectively halting any cavalry charge and completely changing the landscape of medieval warfare.
Hwacha. This remarkable artillery weapon from 15th century Korea was built explicitly to repel massive waves of Jurchen and Japanese cavalry. It consisted of a two-wheeled wooden cart that held a launching pad capable of firing up to 200 rocket-propelled arrows simultaneously. Each arrow was fitted with a small gunpowder tube and a sharp iron tip, creating a devastating wall of fire and explosives when launched into a tight formation of charging horses. Even if the arrows missed their targets, the terrifying noise, smoke, and flashing explosions would instantly panic the warhorses, shattering the enemy's momentum before they could ever reach the defensive lines.